In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Everyone knows where this is from. The first verse in the Bible. It has been read this way by nearly everybody for more than 2,000 years, and yet recently hundreds of biblical Hebraists have said the very first word in the Bible has been mistranslated all of this time. Why would they make such a claim? And what does this say about the age of the earth? Today I have Max Kretov. We're going to talk about a very controversial subject, how to translate the very first word of the Bible, Bereshit. Is it when God began to create? In the beginning God created? And how does this change the discussion of the origins debate and how we interpret the Bible? How are you doing today, Max?
Doing great. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Pleasure
All
to be on
right.
here.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking with you and chat with you, and I'm excited to see how this goes. So your background, what is your experience in Hebrew and all that kind of stuff?
All right. Well, I'm a big Bible nerd. Follow Jesus, so I'm really interested in his Bible, which is Christian Bible, but specifically the Old Testament really interests me. So I've spent most of my free time last couple of years just nerding out as much as I can in Old Testament background, Hebrew, a little bit of Greek, and yeah, it just really interests me. So, and this issue in particular, I've spent a lot of time on. I've been studying Hebrew for 3 years, maybe, but been really focusing on it. And so recently finished a master's paper, not a thesis, but for a master's class on this subject. And so that's the only credential I can offer. But as someone who's really interested in this topic, I feel pretty confident that I've dipped my toes enough to have an opinion.
Yeah, and I'd say that one of the big reasons I wanted to have you on here is not simply because I appreciate your ideas, but we've been kind of diving into this together ever since my first interview with Dr. Henry Sun. We've kind of gone back and forth and discussing different arguments for it, and I just wanted to get your ideas out to the public. But for people not familiar with my knowledge and stuff like that, I've taken 4 classes of Kairos Classroom in Hebrew, which is basically Mark Furtado's book, and just basically dove into all the relevant literature on this topic, trying to talk to everybody I can on it. But so this should be good. So just for the audience, people not familiar with this topic, could you give us a summary of the main options for how to translate Genesis 1:1, as well as their implications? What is the significance of all this?
All right. Well, the first place to start is just to recognize there are multiple options for understanding the first verse of the Bible. I didn't know that for a long while in the church. And I know a lot of people aren't familiar that it's ironic, but the first word of the Bible is debated, and we're actually not completely sure how to translate it. So yeah, there are uncertainties, and so our translations are doing interpretive work for us. Unfortunately, they've all really only represented one view, and so that's sort of why it hasn't come on to a lot of people's radars. But yeah, there's roughly 2 options, 2 very common. It's like 2 camps, basically, you can say, in this discussion as for understanding the first verse of the Bible. And I'll start with the simplest way I can think of to explain it, and then we'll move on a little bit, talk a little bit more about grammar. But so we can view Genesis 1:1 in 2 halves. There's the first word or phrase in the beginning, or in Hebrew it's ba, that's the preposition in. Reshith, that's the word we translate beginning. There's that, and then there's the second half, which is the rest of the verse. There's God, there's the event of him creating the heaven and the earth. And so here's the 2 options. The first half can modify the second half, or the second half could modify the first half. And so what I mean by that is that when we look at the word beginning, you need to ask what kind of beginning, right?
Right.
And in English, it's obvious, right? Our translations give it to us in the beginning. But again, that's option 1. That's where the first word specifies when the event takes place. And so there's the event in the second half. There's God, the subject, creating the object, heaven and earth. That happens when? In the beginning. Okay, that's option 1. You have the first word providing a time setting for the second half. But you can also go the other way around, and this would be option 2, where you have the second half of the verse specifying when the beginning is, or what beginning we're talking about. And so look at the beginning and you ask yourself which beginning, right? Because assuming there's no the in English, just looking at the Hebrew, there's no the, so you have to ask yourself what kind of beginning. And so the second option says, well, it's when God created the heaven and the earth. So I hope that puts it into somewhat simpler terms, because I know looking at it without a knowledge of Hebrew, you think, well, how could you put it another way? Well, it's just vague. There's just there's less to it than the English translations we typically read make it out to be. And so because it's a little bit more vague, you could have something like option 1, in the beginning, that's when God created the heaven and the earth. But in this less common option, you figure out which beginning it is, and that's the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so that's the simplest way I can think of putting it. But when we talk about like why that is, here's why. Basically, the question is whether the first verse of the Bible is an independent sentence or a dependent sentence. And so those are technical words, but they're pretty simple. Like, is the sentence a complete thought, right? Is it a sentence? Is the verse 1 a sentence, or is it half a sentence and it like continues on into verse 2 or verse 3 or something like that? And so in option 1, which is our traditional interpretation, which we read in most of our translations, it's a independent sentence. So it stands alone and it represents an event. Like, this is, I'm telling you, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, and then there's option 2, where you look at in beginning, and we assume that the second part of the sentence is telling us which beginning, right? Because we don't know which beginning. And so that results in a dependent sentence. So the NRSV illustrates this. They interpret the sentence to be specifying when the beginning was. So in the beginning, which beginning are we talking about? We're talking about the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. But that's not a complete thought. Like, you need an event. In the beginning, God, what did he do? Well, as our NRSV has it, it's verse 3. And God said, let there be light, right? So that would be the event in the sentence. And verse 1 would just be like a time. The whole sentence, the whole actually verse would be the time setting for that event. So you could also put it that way. Option 1, first word gives us the time. The rest of verse 1 is the event. Option 2, all of verse 1 gives us the time, and then verse 3 gives us the event. Maybe that helps clear it up a little bit.
Yeah, so that of course changes how we interpret the passage as well, right? So if it is when God began to create, or in the beginning of, or in the beginning when God began to create, or something like that, it doesn't tell you a specific time point when God created, compared to when you say in the beginning, it's the very beginning.
Yeah, the implications are different, clearly. In the traditional view, probably what you have, the implication is that verse 1 of Genesis 1 gives you an event that happens at the very beginning of time. So the implication would be nothing happens before Genesis 1:1. That might be one of the main implications. And then in option 2, you wouldn't have that implication, because you know where you're starting, but you don't know where that is relative to like the absolute beginning. You just know that in the beginning when God created, this happened. And so that's the main difference, is that in the traditional or the option 1 view, you're being told this is the beginning. God created everything starting here. Whereas in option 2, it's more like, hey, back when God started to create, this is what happened. And so those options have different implications for what we think the text says about the chapter relative to the very beginning of time.
Right, exactly. Also, it helps us determine whether the water was the very first, like the water was there before God started creating the tohu vavohu, and did God create like everything in Genesis 1:1, or is this like just a title statement? Or if it's just when God began to create, then it doesn't tell us anything about where the water came from, or the Spirit of the Lord, or anything like that. So that's going to affect our interpretation of that very first three sets of verses there, and we have to understand what that one word means before we can even make any conclusions on that. But you also there's the one view, which is that maybe there was other multiple creation events, right?
I think Robert Homestead is actually, that's the view he takes, and that's, I think, he provides the best grammatical like interpretation. And so I would tend to think that's the best option, is that, hey, there's a lot of Reshits out there. There's a lot of beginnings of something, right? But Genesis 1:1 is just starting in one of those. It's saying, hey, in the beginning, which one? When God's creating the heavens and the earth. Yeah, I think that's plausible.
All right, so let's dive into that grammar. So most people are familiar with the in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but most or very little people are familiar with the arguments behind why we should translate it as when God began to create, or in the beginning of. So what would you say are the best arguments for taking that interpretation?
Well, we have to realize, first of all, that we're studying ancient text, and that's a difficult thing. And so the best way to know how to read it would be to ask like an Israelite, right? Or the person who wrote it, or a native speaker of ancient Hebrew, right?
Sure.
But we don't have that. And so the best way to interpret any verse is to look at how those words, how that grammar works in the rest of the Bible. That's all we have, really. I mean, we have a few texts in ancient Hebrew, but it's very, very little. And so really, when we're figuring out anything as far as grammar in the Hebrew Bible, we're just looking at other verses in the Hebrew Bible. And so when we do that for this verse, I think what we see is that there is no parallel in the Hebrew Bible for the traditional view. So there's the traditional translation we have. It assumes a few grammatical points, but I don't think you can find those grammatical points elsewhere in the Bible. And so that's, I think, is the best reason to go for the second option. I think it has better parallels. It has more, I'd say it's more possible. It's more probable to be like an actual way to read it. And so to go into the specifics of what happens when you search around the Hebrew Bible for parallels, this is what you find. Okay, so you look at all the times that Reshith is used, beginning, we'll translate it, and you ask yourself, like, how many times does it occur with the definite article the? How many times does it occur without it? And then you ask, does it ever occur on its own? Like, can it stand on its own, or does it need to be complemented by something else? So there's some words that we call them like relative words, where their meaning depends on another thing. And so let's take a similar word to Reshith is Rosh. They're actually related. Rosh means head in Hebrew. And so it's always relative to a body, to a person, or to the main body in a metaphorical sense. So that's an example of a relative word.
The idea of a word being relative is kind of a difficult topic to understand. So here are a couple examples from the Bible where it is used in this way.
Job 8:7, which uses the same language to refer to the early time period of Job's life, and Jeremiah 28:1, which refers to the beginning period of Zedekiah's reign. In Judea at that time, the king's first year did not begin with his accession to the throne, but later on the first day of the coming new year. Prior to the new year, the king would reign up to the point under a preliminary period of time. Jeremiah, in this passage, is referring to the preliminary time period of the king's beginning reign, and the same language is used in Genesis 1:1. Supporting the idea of the verse refers to a temporal duration instead of an absolute beginning point.
So my main reason for adopting that second position is because of that first word, reshith. It's almost always relative in meaning in the Bible. So its meaning is always dependent on something else. We call this the construct state. And so in our verse here today, the main debate is actually, is it in construct or not? And we can get into what that is exactly a little bit later. But basically what that means is that it's relative in meaning. And so the way I look at the evidence is that the word is always relative in meaning. And so probably it's also relative in meaning here in Genesis 1:1, which results in the translation where it's dependent on another sentence.
Okay, so every time the word Bereshit is used in the Bible, it's like 5 times or 4 times, something like that, and it's always translated as in the beginning of, or that similar meaning, that second option, when God began to create, that same type of meaning, and that's the same exact word. So every time that word Bereshit is used in the Bible, it has one meaning, which is like the idea of when God began to create. But then you also have all these other instances where Bereshit isn't used, it's Reshit. So it's like the total count of how many times it's used in the Bible, apart from Genesis 1:1, is like 51 times. You in your paper actually argued that every single time it was used relatively. Could you talk about why you think that?
Yeah, so we're actually both sides of the camp. I mean, both different interpretations are pretty agreed on most of the data about the word and how it's used, except for one verse, actually. And so really, a lot of the disagreement between the groups has been how you handle that one verse. And it's obviously that one verse is hugely important, because if it is a good parallel, then boom, the traditional interpretation has their anchor. They have their example of this is how we understand it. But if that verse is not supposed to be a good parallel, then that means that there is no good example in the rest of the Hebrew Bible of this traditional interpretation. And so it's actually pretty simple. Like you could do this study yourself, even if you don't know Hebrew. You just need to know how to search original language, which on Logos, you just like right click, search. Basically, you search for the word reshith in the Old Testament. It occurs a total of like 54 times or something like that. But they're not all important, because sometimes they're different, like they mean different things. So a lot of time reshith means first fruit, because the word really just means like firstness, like firstosity, if that was a word. And so you can have the firstness of fruit, and so first fruit, right? So in that case, it's a noun. It refers to fruit, So that doesn't compare to Genesis 1:1. Like we're not talking about first fruit. So you can eliminate all those instances, you see, and that's how you start narrowing down to those examples of the word that actually matter. So basically, what we're looking for is all the other times in the Hebrew Bible where reshith is used temporally to refer to time, not first fruits, not the firstborn, not the top of something, right? But it's used as a time word. And so that narrows it down from 50 something to like 18 is the most generous number I can come up with. So you can find about 18 times where it's used as a time word. And so you look at those words and you can start comparing them to Genesis 1:1. And what you find is that none of them have the definite article. Okay? So that's one important thing to keep in mind. And here's the kicker. They all occur in the construct state except for one. So basically, we're just that close to saying that this word is always indefinite and in construct. Does that make sense so far?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that's where the debate is mainly, in terms of looking at the data, at least. It's what we do with that one exception. Like I said, there's one exception, and that verse is Isaiah 46, verse 10. If you're like reading commentaries on Genesis 1:1, they'll discuss this, right? And they'll defend their position. And proponents of the traditional view option 1, we're calling it, they'll often recognize like, hey, yeah, the word is almost always relative in meaning, and it never has the article when it's used as a time word. But there's Isaiah 46:10, and that sort of is their defense. And so you can read that, for example, in like Gordon Wenham's commentary, Victor Matthews' commentary, Victor Hamilton's commentary, and Kenneth Matthews' commentaries. Those are like the big evangelical sort of commentators people turn to. They all make the same argument. Basically, they point to Isaiah 46:10 and say, boom, this is our example.
I was just going to say that idea is almost like, okay, it's possible, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, as long as it's a possibility grammatically, then we have reason to pursue it or to argue for it. Yeah, but what I did in that paper is just look really closely at that verse, and I don't think we're looking at it the right way. And so I was really surprised, like, hey, we're putting so much weight on this one verse, especially in the traditional view, but no one's really like going to that verse and putting forward the argument that it's supposed to be this way and that way. And so I decided to look at it. Now, okay, I did find out that we are looking at the verse. I just hadn't found scholars. So like I have Paul Humbert behind me. He did a look at that verse, and he wrote about it in an essay. We can link it if you'd like, but he's sort of the main guy who's made the argument from that verse. And he's the guy that the commentators quote. So you can see him quoted by Hamilton and by Wenham. And so I decided to look at his arguments and to evaluate them. And basically, I think they're not the best. I mean, they're good, but I think there's a better interpretation of Isaiah 46:10. And I don't think it helps the traditional view, basically.
Okay. Can we dive into the verse and get people an idea of what the verse is saying and maybe why you disagree?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll read it in the Legacy Standard Bible. Remember the former things long past. For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my counsel will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. The reason why this verse is so important to thinking about Genesis 1:1 is because of the way it behaves with the article, the definite article, the. So for context, one of the main things to figure out in Genesis 1:1 is why there isn't a definite article. Maybe you didn't know this. If you're watching Genesis 1:1 in the beginning, right? In English, we have the beginning as the definite article. But in Hebrew, there is not a physical, like a explicit definite article. There's no article there. And that's something that's important. Like, you'd expect it to be there, maybe. And so that's something that is huge in the debate here, in the discussion. And so in the traditional view, what they say is, okay, there's no article, but it can still have a definite meaning. And so it doesn't need to have the article to mean the beginning. It can still mean the beginning, even if it doesn't have the. That's the argument of the traditional translation. And the justification for that is this verse, where Isaiah says, declaring the end from the beginning. And what do you have it? There's no article before beginning here in Isaiah 46:10, right? So there you have it. You have a parallel. You have declaring the end from the beginning, definite meaning, the beginning of time, right? But there's no article. So boom, you could have the same thing in Genesis 1:1. There's no article, but it can be a definite meaning in the beginning of time, like the very beginning. That's the argument. But I just don't think that's the right interpretation of the verse. So the reason I don't think that's the best way of reading Isaiah 46:10 is because the context, right? We know context is so important. And so let me continue reading in verse 11. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have formed it, surely I will do it. Okay, so in the same breath of verse 10, you get these actions. And so God's declaring, God's saying, verse 11, God's calling, and then he's going to bring it to pass. So this is like one thought. It's really tight parallelism. So you need to understand verse 10 with verse 11 and with verse 9. And what that does is it gives you a better window into what exactly Isaiah means in that phrase that we're focused on, declaring the end from the beginning. So what end and what beginning is being talked about in verse 10? We've just assumed most of the time that it's like the beginning and end of time. But that's not like the most obvious thing that would come to mind in context. It's like there's actually a really specific thing in context here. It's this thing about calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. Now, at this point in the book of Isaiah, that's talking about Cyrus the Persian being used as God's instrument to free his exiles from Babylon. And that's not debated. I mean, that's pretty clear. I think most scholars agree on that. Like, there's these passages in Isaiah where he's talking about what Cyrus is going to do. And so in verse 11, you have this reference to Cyrus being prophetically like referred to. And back in verse 10, that's what he's saying. Like, I declare things before they happen. So it just makes a lot more sense that that phrase in verse 10 is not about the beginning and end of time. It's about the beginning and end of events. Yahweh declares what will happen before they happen. So it's not about the beginning and end of time, but the beginning and end of history or periods of time. The whole point of this passage is that Yahweh predicts, Yahweh declares. And it says that in different ways, but they should be understood the same way, generically, is how it should be understood. It should be understood generally. The point is not that Yahweh declares what's going to happen at the end of time from before time. That's very specific. That's really obscure. That doesn't make sense in context. What does make sense in context is that Yahweh, in general, has the ability to make declarations ahead of time about what's going to happen. He makes prophetic utterances. He declares his will. And that's what Isaiah is saying. He declares from ancient times things that which haven't been done yet. So the point is just in general, before anything happens, Yahweh declares it. Before a bird of east comes, he declares it. And so what I'm saying is that the beginning here, that word, reshith, in verse 10, it's also relative in meaning. That phrase is like more like a proverb. The point is, it could be translated something like declaring start from finish. There's no articles there, start, finish. It's not the start and finish of time. It's just idea. Like there's a finish line, there's a start. And the point is Yahweh declares the finish from the start. It's not about which finish, it's not about which start. It's just the point is that he can do that, right?
Yeah. Let me ask you a few questions here to see if I can maybe clarify further for those that aren't already clear. So when I'm looking at the interpretation, like when God began to create in the beginning, my two options are like one absolute starting point and one like relative, like doesn't specifically say what the starting point is. That's how I'm looking at the context. So in Isaiah 46:10, if we're going to interpret the same way, like I guess those are our two options. When it says I make known the end from the beginning, is in this context, are you saying the beginning is like a relative, like long period of time, or is it just a certain period of time, or is it an exact period of time, or am I completely missing the point of what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. But it would be helpful just to rephrase the word beginning to like start. Because like just even in English, the word beginning, it has these connotations, right? Actually, the way I'm trying to explain this verse in Isaiah, that's how most evangelical, like major commentators put it, which really surprised me. Presumably the same people who would be defending the traditional view in Genesis 1:1 and would appeal to Isaiah 46:10. When you go to those commentaries on Isaiah 46:10, they read it indefinitely. So, for example, Oswalt, John Oswalt, beloved commentator on Isaiah, Alec Motyer, much beloved commentator on Isaiah, even John Goldingay, International Critical, Blenkinsop in the Anchor Bible, they all have a similar translation. It's somewhere along the lines of this: declaring or announcing the outcome from the beginning. or the start. And some of them don't even have the article. So it could be announcing the outcome from the start or from. And so, like, you could translate it that way. And obviously, when you would read that, you wouldn't think like the point is about the beginning of time. The idea is just generic. It's just general. It's not specific. That's the whole point, is that in general, God can declare things. And so I'm glad to find out I didn't come up with that argument. Well, I did, but I'm not the first one. So Paul Humbert is a French scholar. He made the same argument, and thankfully he also pointed to the Septuagint. He made a helpful point. Basically, the Greek translation of this verse in Isaiah 46, it takes it that way. And so here's an English translation of the Septuagint, like some English Septuagint, who declares beforehand the final things. Okay? So instead of from the beginning, it's beforehand. It's just, you see the difference there. It's hard to put to words, but it's a different interpretation. And guess what it does with the end? It says the final things, who declares beforehand the final things.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so final things is end of time. I guess you could take it that way, but it's plural. So it's not talking about the beginning and the end. It's just saying, and guess what? The verb is plural too. Who declares beforehand the final things before they happen. In Greek, that's plural. And at once they are accomplished. So again, that's plural. And so even the Septuagint puts it in such a general, broad way. Like, here's things that happen. Before they happen, Yahweh declares them. And so that's the point. But Reshith there is generic. It's relative to something else. So before that something else happens, he declares it.
Yeah. Yeah, in your paper, you also made an interesting argument where it looks like the writer of Isaiah is, I guess, making 6 lines, and you have AA, BB, CC. I'll put it on the screen after editing, but could you explain maybe what's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. What I'm trying to do is look at the poetic structure and see what's the pattern. Does it start general and become more specific? Does it start specific and become more general? And basically what the poetic structure shows is that each line increases in specificity. So it starts in the first line generally. So it just tells you that Yahweh declares future things. And then in the second line, it explains the kind of thing that he declares, which is his purpose, his plan. And then in the third set of lines, it's the exact thing that he is declaring to be his purpose, which is Cyrus being his instrument. And so that is compelling to me, that in verse 10, you already have Cyrus in view. And so I still think verse 10 is general. It's meant to be general, but it just shows how if the author was thinking about something specific, it's not the beginning of time. It's Cyrus in verse 11, is it? Because you can see that's where he's going. He's just building this little step ladder to say that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, to repeat the significance of this, if Isaiah 46:10 is using Reshith in a indefinite relative way, what that would mean is that to take the word as, Bereshit as in the beginning in Genesis 1:1 would be to say that it's using a word Bereshith in a way that it never uses in the rest of the Bible and all the other 50 or so times that it's mentioned. So, I mean, some scholars would even say that, like if this were true, that we could confidently say that, yeah, this just doesn't happen. It didn't happen. That's not the way you can use the word. But as we mentioned before, though, Isaiah 46:10 is typically that one way where it's like, oh yes, it can be used that way because we have one example, and even though it's one out of so many different other options where it goes against it, it's that one, and it's still possible, and that's what matters. But there was something else that you mentioned before we kind of got onto all this, which is that the there's no definite article there.
Right.
And your argument, I mean, or specifically Michael Heiser was, that was his main argument. And that was actually the only one he used, interestingly enough, to argue for when God began to create.
It's a major
But
point.
yeah, so, well, and I guess the idea is like, hey, if the definite article isn't there, then most of the time in the Hebrew Bible, um, it's used indefinitely. Like, so at the same time though, people that take the in the beginning God created Bereshit, the beginning type of view, they'll point to other instances where there isn't a definite article, but a word is still used definitely. You also have pointed out that maybe this isn't one of those instances with the word reshit. It's not it's like only a certain class of words do that. Is that your opinion?
Well, I'm glad you're asking me that. That's an important issue. Yes, I do think it's a specific class of words, and that matters. But what you were referring to is just how we look at how that article works in Hebrew. And yeah, it's not always there as a consonant. Sometimes it's just a vowel, as is basically what you were referring to. When you have
Uh-huh.
a preposition before a word, that preposition will take the article as a vowel. So instead of b reshith, the article would be ba reshith, or actually ba, because there's a guttural next to it. But yeah, it would be, that's I think what you're referring to.
Mm.
Now that's just like a little bit of a different topic as far as the class of a word. Yes, that is very important. So in English, if there's no article, that means a lot, but in different languages, it isn't always like that. So Hebrew is one of those languages where you can not have the article and it could still be definite. It just depends on the word and its meaning.
Okay.
So yeah, the question is what is reshith? Does it need the article or does it not? And that's actually one of the most important linguistic questions here. That would solve the issue. Is if like we knew, does it need the article or not? That would solve the problem. The problem is we don't know. My argument is that when you look at the data, it's not that it needs the article, but it doesn't have the article ever for a reason. And that reason is because it's combined with other words. So in English, we do this by saying in the beginning of. In the beginning of King, blah, 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 this happened. That's how the word's always used, except for Isaiah 46:10, which we talked about that. But every other place, which is like 17 times, yes, temporally, 17 times, it's always in the beginning of this guy's reign, in the beginning of this year, in the beginning of that, so on and so forth. And so the idea is that it never needs the article because it receives its specificity. That's like what the article does. It specifies what we're talking about from the thing it's describing. So in beginning, we don't know what beginning we're talking about. In English, we say in the beginning of this king's reign. But in Hebrew, you wouldn't say in the beginning. You would just say in beginning of the king's reign. And that second the would work for the beginning. Does that make sense? So we use the article before each word in a phrase in the beginning of the king's reign. Hebrew only uses it for the last, what we call the host or the head of the phrase, and the previous elements just receive the specificity from that. So in Hebrew, it would be horse of the king means in English the horse of the king. And so yeah, I was explaining that's how I think the article works with the first word of the Bible, is that it never takes it because it's always combined with something else. And why is it always combined with something else? Because it's always relative in meaning. It's always the beginning of something. And so in the traditional view, they don't think it works that way because of Isaiah 46:10. And they'll say, well, look, it's not always the beginning of something. Sometimes it's just the beginning. Doesn't need the article. But again, it is the beginning of something in Isaiah 46:10. You mentioned other scholars making an argument about word class. And I think what you're referring to is the argument that, hey, let's look at similar words to reshith, and let's ask how they behave. And that's another important argument for option 1.
Mhm.
Basically, there are other time words which don't have to have the article to refer to the beginning of time.
Mhm.
And so they'll say, look, here's some examples. There's no article here, but this time word clearly refers to the beginning of time. Therefore, maybe the same thing's happening with Reshith. And that, for a long time, that's been a great argument. It sounds convincing, right? That's a good way to analyze grammar, right? Of course, you need good parallels. You need words that really are similar. And basically, the words that have been traditionally compared to Reshith, I do not think are that similar. So if you're a Hebrew nerd or if you're interested, the words are Rosh, Kedem, Olam. Those are translated like eternity or old times or head or before. Yeah, those are different. So Olam is just really complicated. That it's just so much different that it doesn't make sense to compare them. Like Olam inherently refers to strange time. Like that's actually what the word means. It's hard to translate. It just means like distant, unknown time. And so, of course, it doesn't need the article. Where we're talking about like unknown, distant time in the eternity past. And so that's an example of like a word that I don't think you should use to compare to Reshith, which is like we know what time we're talking about with Reshith. But I mean, that's all technical. And Robert Holmstead made the point that actually it was Josh Wilson in his dissertation was actually trying to analyze that argument, and he ended up not using it. So this is Joshua Wilson. He wrote a dissertation on this topic, defending the traditional view, and he's doing his thorough research, and he brings up that argument, as you should as a PhD student, and he basically says, hey, this isn't a good argument. I'm not going to use it. And that's where I get what I'm saying right now is, so I think that's pretty indicative of that argument. But I don't know if it was him that said this or it was somewhere else that I found it. But basically, if we do want to compare Reshith to those similar other words, fine. Guess what? There are better words to compare it to. So let's compare it to those words. Actually, it's one word, acharith. It means end. Let's compare beginning to that word, end. And what do we get? Same thing. No article, indefinite. There you go. So we're comparing it. Those scholars are usually comparing it to the wrong words, in my opinion. And so I think when we compare it to the right words, that really shoots that whole like approach, in the foot, because it argues for the second option.
Common argument for interpreting Genesis 1:1 as a relative phrase, like when God began to create, is that this formulation parallels the first sentence and structure of the beginning of other creation accounts that were written near the time of Genesis. Here's a video explaining this.
This actually makes Genesis 1 cohere more with how ancient Near Eastern creation accounts begin. Verse 1 is seen as a stage-setting prepositional phrase for what follows, a dependent clause, followed by verse 2, a circumstantial clause, and finally arriving at verse 3, the main clause. As Ben Stanhope says, this formula was the customary way to open a creation account, as it is the same structure in the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, Assyrian Carrefour tablet, and the creation account of Adam and Eve, beginning in Genesis 2:4b. So Genesis 1 should be understood as a dependent clause, and God's first creative act doesn't begin until verse 3, when God says, "Let there be light."
It seems unlikely that such an odd formulation would be so common in these other texts, especially in Genesis 2, which is so close to Genesis 1. This makes it more likely that the writer of Genesis 1 preferred the when God began to create interpretation because Genesis 1 would match the structure perfectly while any other view would not. Do you find that convincing?
I think those are valuable things to consider, but I like to have evidence in like different tiers of importance.
Okay.
And so for me, that's a little bit lower on the tier list of important things to consider. Now, if we didn't have grammatical things to look at, that might be one of the main things that we could go off of. But yeah, I don't think that's terribly reliable because I can see perfectly why it would be similar to those other texts. I could also see why it wouldn't be. It could go either way. But you mentioned Genesis 2. was it 4 through 7?
Yep.
Yeah, basically the argument there is that it doesn't matter how you look at the accounts, but there's like the first creation account, then there's like the part 2 in chapter 2,
Yeah, whatever
and
those.
with the like introduction basically in verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made earth and heaven. Now no shrub of the field, blah blah blah, had happened, but a stream would rise from it. Then God formed man. So those 4 through 7 there is a long introduction to that account. And basically the argument is that, hey, that's a great parallel to the first 3 verses of Genesis 1. And so it would be satisfying.
Yeah.
Like we know that these texts are very, very literarily sophisticated. Like they're beautiful, the way they're set up, the parallelism, the way the days fit together, the introductions, the conclusions. I mean, even the number 7 is fit in there. Like there's like pairs of 7, everything's 7. There's like watch the Bible Project class on Genesis 1. It's incredible. Tim Mackey has like a 15-hour class on just Genesis 1. And basically all he does is look at literary structure. Okay. So that's how incredible the artistry is to these passages.
Yeah.
And so it would make sense that when you look at them together, they would like fit. Like there's an introduction over here, similar to an introduction over here. And there's a conclusion over here, similar to a conclusion over here. So yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense. It fits a lot better together if you have 4 through 7 being this like long sentence or idea parallel to a long idea over there. Now you can run the parallel other ways with the traditional view, but it just works a little bit better. It's closer. It's a closer parallel with the option number 2.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so the big like go-to argument in this discussion from my experience is, hey, like church history. Okay, so from the very beginning of our earliest interpretation of Genesis 1:1, which is the Septuagint, which is not in Hebrew, but we know that they interpreted it as a definite, well, it's a lot of scholars at least, they'd say that, hey, we know it's definite because they translated it as in arche, which is, in their opinion, in the beginning. And that is, around 200-300 AD or 200-300 BC. And, that's really early. That's our earliest mention of this. So what you're essentially arguing is that, hey, the people that knew Hebrew like super, super early that translated into Greek messed this up. And so did so many other translators and interpreters that they translated it as an independent statement as in the beginning for all this time. And how do you interpret, like, what do you do with that information? Specifically, the Septuagint, seem to be translating it differently. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, there's 2 ways we could look at it. We can try to evaluate what the Greek actually was thinking, what they were translating.
Okay.
Or we can ask whether it matters or not. And so I'm actually going to skip to that second one because that's more important, actually. It's just like how much do we actually weigh the evidence of the Septuagint? And of course, like it's important. Those are probably native speakers of biblical Hebrew. So like if anyone should have known what was going on in Genesis 1:1, it should have been them. And that's why you're asking me. And yeah, I don't like to say that they're wrong. I hate to have to say that. I wish that the way I look at the evidence pointing towards, I wish I could say that that was the traditional view, but it's not. And yeah, what that means, I'm not sure. Is it, here's the thing, like personally studying all sorts of topics in the Bible, and hopefully you guys can relate, especially if you're watching Zach's channel, like you just like to cover these topics that are like controversial and things that go against tradition in a way. I think we've all had an experience if you've studied those types of things where you just find that there are times, where you just like realize something we've got totally wrong in your church tradition. And I've had enough of those moments. Not that I'm looking for them, but I've just realized, hey, there are times where tradition gets something wrong. And I think we all have to recognize that's a possibility, right? And I think we all do. It's just that in practice, when we come across those things, it's really hard to say, hey, I think we got this wrong. Let's fix it. But yeah, I do think there's room for that. And I think this is one of those cases. I think, unfortunately, somehow, I don't know how, tradition, ancient translators got it wrong. And somehow we're looking at it differently now. So yeah, it's about weighing evidence. Like I said, the whole tiered thing of evidence for me, the Hebrew text is like tier 1. That's what matters, and then the Greek text is like lower, right? I think everyone agrees that's how it has to be. And so if someone is convinced that the Hebrew Bible evidence points you in this direction, then I think you better go in that direction. I think it would be wrong to look at the evidence of the Septuagint to like override that, right? So yeah, for me, it's just a thing of priorities.
At the same time, other scholars have argued that the Septuagint didn't read Genesis 1:1 as "in the beginning," though. Take, for example, Dr. Robert Homestead, who argues arche is used with the article elsewhere in the Septuagint to reference a beginning. This indicates that the Septuagint provides an ambiguous witness at best, and certainly does not support reading Maseretic text Bereshith as definite. For those curious, scholars like Dr. Michael Heiser have argued it would be better interpreted as, in the initial period, God created the heavens and the earth, in the Septuagint.
Now, if anybody knows Greek, we have NRK. We do not have a definite article there. To be really strict, you would say in beginning, or idiomatically, to begin with, or when God made the heavens and the, you initially would be a good word. Initially, God created. But again, that leaves an incomplete thought. It feels like it's leading somewhere as opposed to being, definite point in time. And in the case of the Septuagint here, they do not have the article.
Well, I think you just summed it up there. It can go either way in Greek as well. Scholars have said, hey, there's the same problem. Like the word can work with the article, it can work without the article. So I guess the reason that's significant is it just tells us that the Greek is also a little bit vague, at least on the article. So yeah. The Greek is a bit more clear where they're going with the syntax, with the way the sentence works. Mm-hmm. But it's a little bit less clear what they thought about the article, because they don't translate it with the article in Greek. But like Homestead pointed out in his second article, there are times where they do say ten archen, so the beginning. So I guess on the article, it's a bit mixed what the Septuagint what they might have thought. But in terms of the sentence level, I think they clearly thought it was one sentence.
I mean, just from my opinion, my research, I think there's actually a lot of reasons to doubt like their ability to understand Hebrew. I mean, there's like a billion different places you can point to where they like completely mess things up, like the Septuagint translators, where you're like, there's no way they could have come to this conclusion like with a sane mind. Like,
yeah, someone was having a bad day.
Yeah, clearly. Yeah, it was some just really baffling things. But specifically in this instance, we actually do have examples where they mistranslate similar verb construction. So in my last interview where I interviewed on this topic was Dr. Henry Sun, and we talked about how Bereshit is supposedly a construct noun, and a lot of people would say, oh, no, you can't have that construct noun next to a finite verb, which is the word bara. You can't have those two types of words next to each other because that just doesn't happen in Hebrew. Well, of course, you can mention a bunch of times where it does happen in Hebrew, but then a lot of people say, okay, well, it's really awkward or it's bad, and like that's why it was never used or very rarely ever used that way. But it's interesting that we actually have examples in the Septuagint where they actually did make the same mistake in other places. In Hosea 1:2, which is like almost everybody in the world agrees like, hey, Hosea 1:2, that has a construct noun with a finite verb, just like Genesis 1:1 would be under your opinion. And so like it's certainly possible, but in the Septuagint they messed up the translation and they translated it differently than what we know is what it was originally, according to almost nearly every scholar in the world. Additionally, Jeremiah 6:15 and Jeremiah 50:31 also seem to mistranslate the relative clauses. So it seems like, okay, maybe they just had a difficult time with translating relative clauses. But you can also look at other later rabbis, and they mistranslate the same Hebrew construction in a really odd way. Would that be Psalm 81:6 as well as Hosea 1:2? And you can look on my screen for the citation for all that. But it seems like people in ancient times seem to maybe not understand this form of Hebrew construction very well. And maybe that's why they mistranslated Genesis 1:1 in the Septuagint and maybe all these other ancient texts.
Many will be surprised to know the 4th century Jewish Midrashim Mekilta, as well as the later Tanumach Bashemot, claims the Septuagint translators changed the meaning of the first verse.
But yeah, I mean, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, no, you're right. There's all sorts of reasons why a Septuagint translator might have got something wrong. And like, you're right. We do have a lot of examples where they do get things wrong. And so we all know that's a possibility. It's just that it just seems really improbable that they would get the first verse wrong, or, and even if, like what you're proposing, that maybe the specific type of grammatical construction they weren't the best at, I mean, even if that's not very convincing, then the point is there are explanations like that. There's all sorts of possibilities like that, which could explain why they got something wrong. I just, the point, we don't need to come up with the answer of like why they got it wrong. All we have to do is look at the data and give it our best guess. But yeah, I do think the witness of the Septuagint is important, but obviously the evidence in the Hebrew Bible is more important.
And just for other people's information, Targum Onkelos translated it as in former times, so neither translation, but it's kind of like that relative meaning in former times. That's how they translate Genesis 1:1, as well as Rashi and Ibn Ezra also translate Bereshit as in construct.
Right.
Max is arguing here. So, all right, and then next year we'll come back, and after we're experts in Greek, we'll have another conversation just on NRK. All right.
Willing.
All right.
Leave it in the comments, Greek nerds.
Yeah, there you go. Dr. Josh Wilson, you've mentioned him here. He did his dissertation on this topic, and he's written for Answers in Genesis, their scholarly journal, if you'll call it that. And he's made all these interesting arguments, and one stayed out particularly that I wanted you to comment on and see what you thought. So basically, he points out that reading it this way, as in like when God began to create, that it requires us to conclude things that don't ever occur anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. So he says, in all 209 examples in the Hebrew Bible, the genitive clauses and their regents, I don't even know how to pronounce that, are not separated from their participatory clauses by both a clause level wall and a verse ending soft pasuk, or with an intervening parenthetical comment like in Genesis 1:2. So obviously that's nonsense to 99% of people listening. But could you maybe explain that sentence there for us, and maybe put it into English, and
Sure.
And why does that not give you pause when interpreting it this way?
Right. Well, basically what Dr. Wilson is doing is he's just taking my interpretation, the option 2, and he's saying, okay, what's the general shape? And then he searches throughout the whole of the Hebrew Bible for that general shape to see if it happens. And he says it doesn't. Okay, that's the argument, is that basically what I see in my interpretation of the grammar, he says it would be really strange for that to be here this way. And he's pointing to 3 things, right? So in Genesis 1:1, you have 3, you could say like, intriguing details, or for him, points that are relevant. I guess it doesn't matter what order. So one thing he sees is that there is a sentence in between verse 1 and verse 3. In the untraditional, in option 2, verse 1 is the first half of a sentence that ends in verse 3. It's actually one sentence, 1, 2, and 3. And what verse 2 is like an aside, a parentheses. Excuse me. So what he's saying is, hey, you never have another example of this kind of sentence with that sentence inserted and these other two things. Okay. And the second thing is a conjunction, basically, in the middle of it. So he calls it a waw. That's the Hebrew letter that is the conjunction and. So when that conjunction is used as a sentence marker, he's saying it's not used in the middle. Like, it would be awkward to insert that, like a strong conjunction, in between a sentence. So he's saying the whole inserted sentence plus the conjunction plus the third thing doesn't happen. And the third thing is the verse ending. At the end of verse 1 in the Maseretic traditional Hebrew text, you have this little semicolon, which is basically like a period. And he's saying, like, if this is one sentence, why do you have that? And so he's saying, hey, that plus the inserted sentence plus the vav conjunction, those three things combined are really awkward. We don't see that anywhere else. The reason I don't find that convincing, for one, is because his goal was to find all of the other examples of such sentences, like Genesis 1 through 3. But I don't think he actually manages to find them. I didn't find these. I just noticed this. Robert Homestead wrote an article, a follow-up article on his other article that Henry Sun talked about on the channel. And he gives some examples of the kind of grammar that option 2 requires. And I noticed those examples are great, but they're not in Dr. Wilson's search. They're not in his data. And so what that means is they ran their searches differently. So Homestead managed to find some examples that Josh Wilson excluded. My guess is that it wasn't on accident. It's just a matter of, like, what you're looking for. So when you're doing this type of study, you're trying to build a really complicated search, a grammatical search, like, hey, I need a noun without the article followed by a predicate that has a verb and it does not have the article and is followed by a prepositional phrase without the direct object marker. And this all needs to happen after a sentence like this, and it needs to happen before another sentence like this, right? That's the kind of search you're running. It gets pretty complicated.
Yeah.
And so depending on how you build it, you'll exclude or include different verses. And so the way that Dr. Wilson built it, he got those 219 or whatever. But it apparently was too specific, the way I see it. Yeah, so I didn't get the chance to look into the details of why Dr. Wilson didn't have all the examples. But that's obviously a big hole in the argument, is if you didn't actually look at all the data. But in general, what he's saying is true, okay? So it's true that you never have another sentence with all those different details, mixed up. But the question is, like, is that convincing? Do we need another example with all those, details?
Mm-hmm.
And, it would be helpful if we did. Like, he has a point. It matters that this would be sort of rare, what we see. But here's the point. His argument is that those three things never occur all at once, but they do occur not at once. Does that make sense? So, for example, if he's saying here in Genesis 1 through 3, there's that, like, verse ending in between the sentence. We do have that happen. We do have a verse ending, sof pasuk, a period, so to speak, in the middle of a sentence. That happens.
Yep.
And his second thing was that, hey, you don't have an interclausal, you don't have a conjunction that would start a new sentence in between a sentence happening. Okay, so we know that happens. It's just that doesn't happen combined with the other thing that doesn't happen, combined with the other thing doesn't happen. So I hope that makes more sense. So what he's doing is stringing together, like, a really specific condition that we're looking for, which I don't think is fair. He proves that you can't have those three things happen. Like, we have examples. And so basically we have possibility. Like, we could say, hey, what we see in Genesis 1 through 3 is weird, but all of those weird features happen. So, hey, they could happen at once. Why not? And Dr. Wilson's right. We don't have another example of them happening all at once. Again, we don't need to have them happen all at once. They do happen. It's not a far stretch to say that they could have happened in a very special and complicated sentence, which, who wrote that book that you sent me recently?
Ben Stanhope.
Ben Stanhope. Yeah, he was looking through the same argument, and that's what he said. Like, it's a complicated situation. It's a difficult sentence. So, and it's a special sentence, right? It's this kind of like introduction. It's got this like legendary tone, like in the beginning when this that and this, the earth was without form, and then God spoke. It's a grand thing. It makes sense that it would break not rules, but it would be a bit different. And so that's why Dr. Wilson's argument there doesn't give me pause.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, Ben didn't mention the sophistry in his book, but there certainly are places where the sophistry is used. And it's not actually the end of a sentence. Maybe just for the audiences, like what that is exactly. Yeah, so you mentioned it's the two dots, but of course those two dots, they were put there around the time of the Middle Ages.
Right. It's not
when the
original
Maseretic
to the text.
Yeah, it wasn't original to the text. So one, we are, even if you go with this argument, you are going off of the specific translator's opinion and of when that should be put there and when shouldn't it. And you do admit that almost all of the time the sophistry is used that it is like the end of a sentence, but there are certainly other times where it's not.
And
So
yeah. But what's interesting is that when it's used in the middle of a sentence, the examples that Dr. Wilson found, the reason why is because the sentences are long. So there's like, I don't know, 4 or something examples of Sof Pasuk in the middle of a sentence. They're long sentences. So of course that makes sense if it would be happening in the first sentence of the Bible if it's 3 verses.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. You mentioned that. So, I mean, do you think the medieval translator or whatever that is, that was adding
Scribe.
those vowels, the scribe, do you think that he actually thought it was the end of a sentence, or was it something else?
I don't think that those are meant to indicate sentences. They indicate verses. And most of the time, verses also indicate sentences. Like, we don't like to break up verses in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah.
Guess what? Sometimes we do have to do it, and sometimes they had to do it. So I don't think the scribe was trying to divvy up sentences. He was trying to divvy up verses. And sometimes he had to break up a sentence. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that is fascinating. Okay, so let's see what else we have here. Oh, yeah. So there is a disjunctive accent in the word Bereshit, and we briefly touched on that in my interview with Dr. Sun, but I wanted to go into that more deeply. So could you talk about why people would be hesitant to take an interpretation like you because of this disjunctive accent? And you can look on the screen and you'll see what that disjunctive accent is.
Yeah, so what accents are is that they are these intricate squiggles that the scribes copying the Hebrew text throughout the ages have added to the words, and the reason they're there is actually debated. We're not completely sure. So one view is that they indicated like pace of reading for singing or for chanting, hence cantillation marks, chant, whatever. Or probably a better view, I read this in Homestead from another scholar, so it's like third hand, but another view is that they align with prosody. I don't know if that's pronounced, but the idea is like the pace, not the pace of reading, but the rhythm of reading. So like when we read, there's a rhythm to it, and you pause at a certain point, and you speed up at a certain point. There you go. So there's some accents that indicate like when you pause. So disjunctive. It sort of stops you a little bit. So yeah, there's one of those disjunctive accents on the word Bereshith. And so a lot of traditional interpreters have tried to use that as evidence to say that the word is on its own. Like, why would you pause if it's not on its own, right? Because I want to read it. I want to continue. Like, Bereshith, when it's like one thought. So, first of all, again, not original to the text. These are Masoretic scribes. 1,000 years later, maybe more, maybe less. It's not part of the like inspired text, we would call it. It's a valuable piece of evidence, right? But again, tiers of data. Now, to address the argument, let me just read Kenneth Matthews. So in his commentary, he explains the argument. This is in footnote 103. I'll send it to you. This is footnote 103. He says, some argue that the Masoretic disjunctive accent tivcha is what we find with Bereshith indicates that the Masoretes read the phrase as independent. So that's his summary. He's saying that a lot of interpreters have seen the accent and they assume that tells us what the Masoretes thought. The scribes. Like we know what the scribes think because we see the accent. But here's what he says next. However, the tivcha is not decisive in determining the Masoretic opinion, since it can be shown that a disjunctive accent occurs with Bereshith when the construct-dependent relationship is certain. So what he's saying is, it doesn't tell us for a fact what the Masoretes thought as far as is it relative or not relative, construct or not construct. Because there's other times it occurs on a word where we know it's construct. So he gives the examples there, Jeremiah 26:1. That's just one example. But yeah, there it is. So it doesn't matter if there's a disjunctive accent because it could still be construct.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. All right. So I don't know how much time you have, but I did want to talk about arguments for the summary statement or reading it as like a title. Genesis 1:1 is the title. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That be the title of the narrative of Genesis 1:1. So what would you say are the best arguments for that position?
Yeah. Well, I used to hold this position. So, fun fact, I think the best argument is the phrase heavens and earth, which I prefer skies and land. I think it's more accurate. Basically, most scholars agree that phrase in verse 1 of Genesis 1, thus the heavens and the earth, is what we call a merism. It's like a poetic device where you take the opposites, like from head to toe, and those opposites signify the whole thing together, right? So head to toe refers to like something being thoroughly to do with your body. And so this could be a merism. God created the skies up top and the land below. And that could refer to everything. So it could just be a little phrase that refers to everything, not necessarily just heavens and earth, but everything, right? And actually, if you search, again, the value of comparing other examples in the Hebrew Bible, if you find this phrase in the Hebrew Bible, it's used like that a ton. Like you find all these passages where it talks about the heavens and the earth, and the point is everything, and the point's not that it's just two items, right? Up and down. The point is everything, right?
Everything in between.
Exactly. And why that's important is because if that refers to everything, and Genesis 1:1 is, let's assume it's its own sentence in the traditional view, then how can you have in verse 1 God creating everything, and then in the next verses he goes on to create those things?
Right.
So it's just like it's a redundancy issue. And so if you're assuming that it's one sentence, then you have two options in the traditional grammar. You have two interpretation options. One is that it's an event, and one that it's not an event. It's like a summary. So traditionally, it's an event. Like this actually happens. Like God created the heavens and the earth in verse 1, and then everything else happened. But like you said, there's a pretty common view in scholarship that it's not an event, but it's a summary. Like it's like a title, and then everything else happens after. Yeah, and the reason that's strong, and I think gains a lot of traction, is because it just flows better with the logic. Like, it just doesn't make sense to say God created the skies and land. No, on the second day, he goes on to create the skies again. And then on the other day, he makes the land again. So, so that's a big one. Another one is just that it makes sense literarily. Like, it makes sense in terms of the art. Like we said, the next account in Genesis 2:4, or we'll call it the same account. Doesn't matter what your view is on that. It also has an introduction. So it would make sense that the Genesis 1 also has an introduction. Yeah, and there's another argument, which is very interesting. This is John Walton. I think it's his idea. At least that's where I read it. He didn't cite anyone. But he says, hey, in the book of Genesis, throughout the whole book of Genesis, we have these catchphrases, these are the generations of so-and-so. These are the generation, right? We call these the Toledoth, or depending on your pronunciation of that word. There's 11 of these in Genesis, and everyone recognizes that's important. Like, you read any introduction to Genesis, any like commentary will tell you, hey, look, it's broken up into 11 sections with these signature little titles. These are the generations of Abraham, blah, blah, blah. But how many are there? Like, what? It was 11, right? Now, come on. We're reading the Hebrew Bible, and we like sevens. And if we're close to a number that has to do with 7 or 12, then we might as well go there, right? And for real, like, watch the Bible Project classes on the Old Testament. You'll see this. But yeah, basically, why would a Hebrew author use the number 11 when you could use 12? Like, it's just too good to be true. And so their argument is that Genesis 1:1 is another title, and then what you get is 12. And so, boom, the book of Genesis, which describes the beginning of God's people, which are the 12 patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel. The whole book would be divided into 12 sections. Like, that would just be amazing. And that's possible. Like, you could say, well, there's no way, because you don't have the word, these are the generations of, in Genesis 1:1, right? And the argument is that, hey, that word never, it's always resumptive. Like, it always looks back to what came before to move the story on. And the argument is, hey, you can't do that in Genesis 1:1 because there's nothing that goes before in the story.
Right.
So there is a reason why there would be a difference. Another reason why that argument makes some sense is because you don't even need to have 11. Like, you could have 10. Esau has 2 in the same chapter. In like chapter 38, I think it's also chapter 39. So in the same like passage in Genesis, Esau of all people has 2 Toledoth statements. Abraham only has 1, Jacob only, you get it. Why would Esau have 2? So I have not come across a good reason for him to have 2. Maybe there is, and this would destroy the argument, but I haven't found one. So the best reason I can think of is that the author was just trying to inflate the number to 12, right? So that's very interesting. I like that. Yeah. Again, I don't think the grammar suggests it, but if the traditional view of the grammar is correct, that's actually where I would go.
Yeah.
Another interesting little argument for the summary title view, like you were saying, is this comparison actually to chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Chapters 2, verses 1 through 3, it's like the conclusion to the account. So, thus, the heavens and the earth, we'll highlight that, were completed, and all their hosts. And on the seventh day, God, we'll highlight that, completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work which God had created in making it. We'll highlight that. And so there's 3 elements there, which we also had in the first verse. Heaven and earth, God, and created. And so the cool thing here is that in 1:1, it goes bara, Elohim, heaven and earth. So it goes create, God, heaven and earth. That's the order. But here it's opposite. It goes, thus the heavens and earth were completed on the seventh day. God completed his work, which he did in making it. So there's like this mirroring going on. There's the beginning of the count, that's the order, and then at the end of the count, it's the same thing in the opposite order. Now, that could just be a coincidence. It's only like 3 words we're looking at. They're keywords. But probably it's on purpose. I mean, because of how beautiful the text is, it's probably on purpose. Which means you have an introduction and you have a conclusion. So there you have it. It would make more sense for verse 1 to be a literary introduction than to just be it. Boom, let's go.
So, with that being said, then, I mean, does that work in favor of reading it as Genesis 1:1 as a relative clause in any way?
I guess, because the comparison would be between a long sentence and like a string of shorter sentences. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it's not one sentence. I don't know if anyone argues for that. Doesn't look like it. But the comparison is more similar in length in terms of word count. Should I count them now? Do you want to do that?
No,
I've never done that.
I mean, there's certainly parallels. I mean, Tim Mackey, clearly shows that it's that parallel is on purpose between a chunk at the end and the chunk at the beginning.
The author of Genesis 1 has woven the number 7 into every part of the story. There are 7 days of creation, 7 announcements that creation is good. There are 7 Hebrew words in the opening verse, and then 2 times 7 Hebrew words in verse 2. And then the statement about the 7th day has 3 lines of 7 words.
I guess for me is what fits better with the data, seeing it as like a summary title statement or seeing it as a relative clause or hypothetically even seeing it as just like a basic independent clause.
Right. Well, if the reversed order that we looked at is on purpose, then what you have is 3 elements, which are, well, actually it could be an argument for the title view and not the relative clause view, because the introduction would be just verse 1 with those 3 elements, and the conclusion would be at the end of the chapter with those 3 elements. So what I'm saying is the 3 elements we'd expect to be in one sentence. And so that could be an argument that verse 1 is one sentence because it has those 3 elements that are reversed at the end. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, it does. So maybe it fits just a little bit better, but that's not going to make or break anything.
Yeah, but there's also, so we're comparing the intro to the outro, but you can also compare the intro to the next intro. So the question is also like, what's supposed to be closer? Is it supposed to be closer to its own outro or to the intro of the next creation account? So that's where it gets a little bit dicey, because you can compare it different ways.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Did you have any other views worth mentioning that you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, I'll mention a third view, which Robert Homestead brought to my attention. So we've been looking at the arguments about definiteness, like is the first word of the Bible definite or not? Is it grammatically definite or not? And is it construct or not? Is it relative? Is it connected to the rest of the sentence or not? And so to put it in grammatical terms, option 1 was indefinite grammatically, definite in meaning, independent sentence. To put it grammatically, the second option was indefinite grammatically, indefinite in the meaning, and incomplete sentence. The third option is just face value. It doesn't have the article, it's not definite, and it's a complete sentence. In a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a perfectly possible interpretation. In fact, Homestead was surprised no one's talking about it. I'm also surprised no one's talking about it. So yeah, I'd like to mention that. Somehow, a third totally defensible grammatical interpretation of the first verse of the Bible, people just ignored. Which it doesn't sound as good as the other ones in a beginning. It's just really generic. So I can see why it's not really popular, but that's just as popular. I mean, possible, right? So we'll throw that.
Well, I guess maybe contextually people would have an issue with it because, I mean, one, there is the inherent idea that, hey, most people think that Genesis 1 is describing the material creation of the world, and you don't create all these things if they've already been created before. So and if this is the first time where everything's been created, then it doesn't make sense to say that there's other creation periods, right?
Right. Right. But it doesn't have to imply that there would be other creation events.
Okay.
It could just imply there were other beginnings. So,
Well, what other kind of beginnings would there be?
the beginning when God didn't create. So the beginning of, we can fantasize what else was going on. Angels, I don't know, just creating space and
Okay.
time.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, like, so just
Mm.
the idea is that in Hebrew, reshith does not have to be so massive as the English word beginning. Like English
Yeah.
word beginning, like you can only have one. Come on. But if reshith is just a really just a lot softer of a word, you can have all
Yeah.
sorts of reshiths, right? So, and that's, if the audience is in that sort of mindset, it makes sense to read, okay, here's one reshith where God created heavens and earth. This is an
Yeah.
initial period. We can call it that. Initial period is a little bit less, up there with connotations.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Max. Awesome getting together here, hashing these things out. Thanks so much for coming on here. We'll all be watching your journey as you become the best Genesis 1:1 scholar in the world. Yeah, thanks again. But otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your night.
I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. It was a pleasure.